and thank you, the 50 of you so far who've signed in. We're expecting a few more. My name's Mark Megalos. I'm from NC State University, and if there's anyone to blame today for today's webinar, that would be me. I had asked Jim Vose a couple months ago if he'd be willing to share the update on the new publication that they have, and we'll be hearing about that today. But in order of appearance today, then, let me welcome Dave Cleaves, the U.S. Forest Service Climate Change Advisor out of Washington, D.C. He'll kick us off, and then we'll hear from Jim, who's a project leader for the Center for Integrated Forest Science. He'll be discussing climate variability in U.S. forests. And then the co-author of that publication that I'll give you a link to during the discussion today will be his colleague from out in Seattle, Dave Peterson. Dave's a research biologist there in the U.S. Forest Service. So I will step away and come back later on with some questions, and we'll encourage all of you, if you do have questions of any of the speakers, to just put them in the chat box. I'll be tracking those, and we'll come back periodically throughout their discussion to make sure we hear from them. So I will turn it over to you, Dave Cleaves.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Yeah, my name is Dave Cleese. I'm with the Forest Service. I'm in the Chief's Office, Climate Change Advisor, and I really thank the organizers of this webinar and the whole webinar series for the opportunity for us to present this National Climate Assessment Forest Sector Report. This series has the hand of extension all over it, the nurturing hand of extension all over it. And after I spent 7 years in extension at Oregon State University, I know what these ladies and gentlemen do behind the scenes to make something like this pull off or come off. And I think my congratulations and my thanks for this. When we're dealing with phenomenon such as the changing climate, learning and innovation really depend on being able to get together, to connect, to exchange what we know and what we know as things change. And I think this webinar series is exactly that. It's a fine example of that. So what we'll do today is work down through the findings of the National Climate Assessment Forest Sector Report. You won't hear much from me. We're going to do this kind of in proportion to what people know, and so I have a very small portion of this. Jim Vose and Dave Peterson will be outlining. They were the co-authors of this report, along with Toral Patel-Wanan and about, I think, 35 or 40 others. Will be outlining what the report says and some of the implications. I do want to just say a little bit about where this report fits. It is a part of the National Climate Assessment across multiple sectors, and it is the technical document for the forest sector that positions the forest sector in with the other sectors as a sector in and of itself, and that's quite important. We could have gotten kind of folded into other sectors and the transportation and urban and other sectors kind of stand on their own. But this basically says that, hey, forestry is enough to have its own technical report and its own component in the National Climate Assessment, which is good. It puts forest where they should be as really a part of the solution. Secondly, I think what we're doing here is because conditions change so rapidly, and even more so under climate change, and the science changes so rapidly, that we need to get above and look and get a big picture of this periodically. What's happening? Where's it going? How fast is it going? How fast is it changing? What the science says, and what it means to people such as yourself who have to make resource management decisions in a changing context. So we really can't make informed policy or management decisions unless we have a comprehensive perspective, not just one or two or three studies. And in that perspective being produced in a very systematic way, subject to peer review, and also subject to thinking hard about what this means to people who are making real decisions that collectively affect the forest resource. So what we're seeing here is kind of a synthesis. It is a synthesis, a fine one really, of the condition of the science and in some cases of the resource in ecological, social, and economic terms. So my congratulations to the authors for putting this together. They brought it together in very rapid time. Also to the production staff of the Pacific Northwest Research Station, who put this together and worked down through some editing under some very tight deadlines over the Christmas holidays, actually. The two things that I think we should watch here are the two themes that come out to me as I deal with climate policy and interagency and other matters here in the Washington office, is that the message here is that forests are part of the solution, that the forests play a key role in the whole changing climate issue and the future, and these forest and ecosystem services they provide, whether it's carbon, water, renewable energy, habitat, are critically important as green infrastructure, and they're really kind of shock absorbers for the kinds of extreme events that are going to play out across all the other sectors. So the way I position the forest, and I use this report to do it, is that we are kind of a foundation for the resiliency of many other sectors, not just the forest sector. And the second piece is that active management based on a solid, comprehensive view of what risks are out there, and the underlying forest management principles and crafts such as silviculture are ways to get to making that solution realizable. So, and I think that's built into the report here. And I think to conclude, I think there's really never a better time to build our knowledge of climate variability and change into what we're doing than to right now, and to demonstrate that we can cope with this change because we have the tools and the partnerships to be able to do that. That theme comes through in this report, and this report really helps us take a kind of a compass reading, or in today's terms, as my younger friends would say, it's really a GPS reading about where we are with the forest resource and the science, and we hope to be taking these readings as we go forward in the future to help us guide us and light the way. So Mark, I think that's it for me. Let's turn it over to the folks who did this and who can report to us what the findings were.
Thanks, Dave, and we'll go straight on to Jim Vose. Jim?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Dave. I appreciate it. What we'd like to cover today are really two big themes, two big topics. One is I'm going to start by synthesizing a little bit about what we think is going to happen in terms of climate change impacts on the nation's forests. And then we're going to transition over to Dave Peterson, who's going to talk about some of the possible adaptation and mitigation strategies to deal with those impacts. As Dave Cleaves said, this is building on the 2013 National Climate Assessment Technical Input Document. You see a picture of the cover on the right side there. I recommend highly that you get a hold of this document. You can go to the Pacific Northwest Station publications website and download a PDF of it. If you struggle with that, feel free to send me an email, and I would be happy to either connect you with the PDF or even send you a hard copy. It is the product of myself and Dave Peterson and Toral Patel Wainand, but probably more importantly, a combination of input from 45 experts from across the nation and across universities, federal service. It is a science document. There's more than 1,000 up-to-date peer-reviewed citations that built the foundation of the synthesis. Now, there's no way that in an hour we can give you the gory details of everything that's in here. So we are really going to hit the high points and hopefully pique your interest and lead you to some further investigation as to what's in the report. So one of the things that we did is we wanted to take a look at the future and use that as a framework for what we might anticipate some of the impacts to be. And the future portends to result in higher CO2 concentrations, warmer air temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, drier in some places, wetter in others, and probably as important as the first three, and that's extreme events more likely, more severe, and longer lasting. Now, of course, this is the consequence of increasing amounts of greenhouse gases, principally CO2. This graph that you see here is the fairly recent output from the Mauna Loa Observatory, which has been tracking CO2 concentrations since 1960. It reached a level of greater than 400. I think that was in the news of CO2 parts per million in the last month. Compare that to pre-industrial levels of 260 parts per million. This is a pretty daunting trend. Now, of course, these increases have had impacts already on the Earth's climate system. Some detailed analysis has shown about a 1.4 increase in temperature over the last 100 years, or about a little bit less than a centigrade increase. Observed and measured loss of Arctic ice, about an 8-inch sea level rise since 1870, and heat waves and extreme temperatures observed more and more frequently. I mean, all over the globe, new records are being set for the warmest temperatures ever observed.
So, Jim, let me butt in here for a moment. We get a lot of questions from clients from time to time who ask that, isn't this just a natural warming trend, and can that explain it?
Right. Well, you know, it's true that the Earth's climate system experiences natural cycles and variability, but I think that the evidence of warming trends being driven by, these recent warming trends being driven by human influences is overwhelming and conclusive. The pace of change, the ability to detect these trends with solid statistical methods, and climate scientists now have models where they can either include or exclude the impacts of human activities on the atmospheric processes in those models. And when they exclude human activities, they can't recreate this historical trend. But when they do include the effects of rising CO2 and other greenhouse gases, they can pretty accurately recreate the observed temperature. So I think that the strength of the science is quite strong. So what does the future portend? What the climate assessment did is essentially provide from experts a template that we could look at and frame our analysis of what future effects might be. And these two graphs come right out of the report. They were generated by a climate expert, Ken Kunkel. And what you see are temperature on the left hand and precipitation on the right hand, and two scenarios. These are IPCC scenarios. One that is brackets the upper range of what might be expected in terms of future emissions. That's the A2. And one that brackets the lower range of what might be expected in terms of future emissions. That's B1. And what we see is that in either case, the projections of future climate suggest a much warmer United States, kind of a range of about 2 to 5.5 or so degrees centigrade by 2100. Precipitation, it's much more variable. This is mean annual change in precipitation from the base condition. But both models predict some parts of the United States to get considerably drier, in particular the Southwest and parts of the Western United States, while other parts of the United States are predicted to get wetter. the Northeast and Lake States part of the United States. Precipitation predictions are a little more uncertain, but I think these general patterns do converge of drier in the Southwest, wetter in the Northeast. Now, that was mean annual precipitation changes, but I think what's even more important is the extreme events and how those might change in both frequency, duration, and extent over the coming decades. And this is just a time trend, again, for various emission scenarios. The important note here is that in all cases, what we see is an increasing percentage or likelihood of extreme, severe, and moderate droughts to the year 2100. So in addition to changes in annual levels, what is probably more likely to have impacts are changes in severity and frequency of these extreme events like drought. Combination of melting ice and warmer sea air temperatures or seawater temperatures suggest a range in sea level rise as well. The black line is what has been observed, and then the colored lines are predictions of what might happen again over that same time frame. And we see here that in all cases there's predicted to be an increase in sea level, but in some cases even up to a 2-meter increase, again depending upon the assumptions of the models and future emission scenarios. Well, how might some of these changes in climate that include both total amounts and also frequency and severity of extreme events impact the nation's forests? Well, we've broken our analysis of these impacts into 3 categories. Direct impacts, indirect impacts that result from altered disturbance regimes that respond to changes in climate and climate variability, and then combined impacts or stress complexes, and I'll explain what we mean by those here in a minute. So the direct impacts are the things that are associated with the climate system: warming, changing precipitation amount and extremes, elevated CO2 and sea level rise, and indirect impacts that we focused on were changes in fire, insects and pathogens, and invasive species. So some of the direct impacts that we predict, and again these are going to be variable in space and variable in time. The report goes into detail where we expect some of these things to happen, but in general, some of the direct impacts that we project in the report is that in some places the result of climate change, especially warming conditions that increase the growing season or warm places where temperature limits growth, is that there might actually be enhanced growth or higher growth where nutrients and soil moisture are available. That could be offset by changing disturbance regimes, but assuming that doesn't interact with disturbance regimes, there are places where growth will actually or could actually be increased. We also then would project lower growth though, where conditions are water limited or where the benefits of the warmer growing and longer growing season are offset by disturbance. Some areas will have much higher mortality due to the extended droughts and high temperatures, changing suitable habitat and species distributions. Some habitats might actually expand while others will shrink, and altered hydrologic, nutrient, and carbon cycling processes. And I'll go into some detail on these here in the coming slides. So just as an example of changing habitat, this comes directly out of the report in Chapter 2, and it shows the changing habitat suitability for sugar maple. And it shows over time some dramatic changes in the suitable habitat for that species. But this is going to happen for many species. There'll be losers and there'll be winners. There'll be some where the habitat shrinks considerably. There'll be some where the habitat actually increases, and that's usually an increase in habitat for dry or xeric tolerant species. In all cases, we anticipate a northward movement and up in terms of latitude, and also a movement in terms of elevation upward. So species that were typically constrained by cold temperatures would move northward. The projected range is 400 to 800 kilometers, or 200 to 500 miles or so north. Now, I think one of the interesting take-home messages here is that this is a habitat model. This is not a change in species distribution per se, because species have to migrate, and there has to be regeneration along that changing condition. And one of the conclusions in the assessment is that the pace of change in environmental conditions and suitable habitat is likely to be much faster than species can migrate. And so there's a disconnect between the changing environmental conditions and the ability of the species to move from what has become an unsuitable habitat to a suitable habitat. That puts a lot of pressure on the regeneration phase of forest migration, and adds some real implications to increasing fragmentation and barriers to migration. So not just a temporal constraint, but also a spatial constraint with fragmentation. So in almost all cases, the pace of change will outpace the ability for species to migrate. In terms of altered cycles, we have already observed changing snow amount, especially in the western United States, but also changes in the timing of snowmelt. And that has some really important implications for hydrologic processes in mountain snow-dominated systems, and can be a real aggravator of wildfire risk, and also susceptibility to insects, because the drought conditions occur much earlier in the growing season with that earlier snowmelt. On the other hand, in areas anticipated to have higher rainfall or higher rainfall events, extreme rainfall events, there's the potential for increased flooding, erosion, and landslides. There's an expectation that warming conditions will accelerate N-cycling processes, and especially mineralization. And unless that extra N is taken up by vegetation, there have been some observations of higher N in streams and some anticipation of greater N in streams with climate warming. In the eastern United States, at least where soil moisture is limited, that increased growth has the potential to increase carbon storage in those forests. Now, that increased carbon storage really depends on a couple of things. One of them is that the current forest area doesn't change, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But also that increased sea storage is maintained so that these forests aren't impacted by drought or other disturbances that could mitigate that increased carbon storage. So while the potential is there for increased sea storage in eastern forests, it really depends on forests staying in forests, and those forests staying healthy and resilient to other disturbances. In general, the report predicts a decrease in sea storage in western forests, primarily due to very large disturbance events like fire and beetle kill. Now, in terms of indirect impacts and stress complexes, for indirect impacts, we're talking about a changing disturbance regime. And listening to the news recently following the fires in Colorado and other western states, wildfire is obviously of great concern, and future projections on wildfire risk and area burned are pretty dramatic. The report projects about a doubling in wildfire area burned, and I'll give some detail here in a minute. But in addition, there's anticipation of continuing and expanded disturbances from insect and pathogen outbreaks, and also an expansion of invasive species. The other topic that I'll cover is that these stresses do not occur individually. There's a combination of warming and drought and fire exclusion and insect outbreaks that often co-occur or occur in combination, and that create stress complexes that will really challenge management to create or deal with the effects on forests, to create resilient forests or deal with the effects of these stress complexes. Some of these stress complexes may indeed result in either novel conditions or novel ecosystems that land managers may have never had to deal with before. In terms of wildfire area burn in the western United States, this graph comes from Chapter 2 in the report, but it essentially shows the projected increase in the area burned for just a single degree of warming. In some places in the western United States, the projected increase in area burned exceeds 600%. And that's just for a degree of increase in warming. Anticipate what that impact might be in that 3 to 5 degree range at the end of the 21st century. Wildfire risk and wildfire area is not just at the western edge of the United States or western region. This is from Chapter 2, at least from one of the papers cited in Chapter 2, and this is anticipated changes in fire risk as indexed by the Keach-Byram Drought Index. And basically what it shows that even in the eastern United States, wildfire risk is expected to move from low to moderate in eastern portions of the southern United States and from moderate to high in western portions of the United States. And those increases are going to occur primarily in the summer and the fall months. So wildfire risk is not just, an increased wildfire risk is not just a western phenomena. Projections of the interactions of climate change with drought or dryness is anticipated to occur in the eastern United States as well. We also anticipate that insect outbreaks will continue. The graph on the right-hand side shows the total acres that have been impacted by mountain pine beetles in the western United States by year. A dramatic increase from 2000 to 2009 due primarily to warming temperatures and drought, or that's the expectation anyway. There's been a drop-off in recent years, most likely because they've run out of food to eat. So the expectation from the report is that the mountain pine beetle and other insects are increasing in spatial extent, beginning to hit different species, moving up in elevation, and that this insect activity is likely to continue and accelerate in the coming years. Again, not just the western phenomena. This graphic is for the southern pine beetle activity in the southern United States. Right now, southern pine beetle activity is actually fairly low in this region, but there's an expectation that with the continuing frequency and severity of droughts, that pine beetle activity will pick up. This is a graph just fresh off the USDA Forest Health Protection website. Anywhere where you see red is where risk is greatest. But the southern pine beetle is not just relegated to the southern United States. Warming temperatures has actually allowed the southern pine beetle to expand into new areas. This is from the New Jersey Pineland region in New Jersey. And the interpretation of the southern pine beetle outbreaks in that region has to do primarily with warmer wintertime temperatures, which have allowed or facilitated a northward expansion of the southern pine beetle range into the pitch pine community in the southern pine or in the pine barrens in southern New Jersey. Now, while this is certainly a little bit more uncertain than some of what we know about fire and some of what we know about insects and pathogens, the report does discuss the potential for invasives increasing their range and their occupancy of forests in the coming decades. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is that with the anticipated increase in disturbances from fire and from insects, the possibility then that there would create habitats that are typically suitable for invasive species. Another factor is that invasives are often limited by temperature as well as natives. And then invasives like kogan grass that are located primarily in the southern United States can move northward as temperatures warm and that temperature limit declines. And finally, there's actually many invasive species that really do well under conditions of elevated CO2. And they get a competitive advantage often in terms of their growth rate and their potential to colonize as a result of that elevated CO2. So all of these factors together, although there's some uncertainty as to where and how severe, suggest that invasives may play an increasing role in the nation's forests as well over time. So this is just an example of the notion of stress complexes. This is an example from coastal forests in the southern United States, but we have similar examples for forests throughout the continental United States and Alaska in the report. But this example shows that forest change is derived or controlled or influenced by a combination of current and future change. Kind of at the biophysical driving level, there are drought and warmer temperatures, more severe hurricanes and sea level rise has direct impacts on the coastal forests that could cause more dead fuels. Drought and warmer temperatures impact the upland forest, which would cause more flammable fuels. And as a result, more stand replacing fires that can then influence species conversion and influence then forest change. There's a significant wildland urban interface in some of these coastal areas that wildfire can threaten both structural and human welfare, reduce productivity. And then there's some other types of institutional limitations that may interact and in a sense contribute to the stress complex, such as air quality limits that may limit the ability to use prescribed fire to deal with some of these wildfire threats. So the bottom line is that it's not just as simple as looking at these individual environmental drivers and disturbances, in that these things occur in combination, and their combined effects interact to create effects that could be greater than any of these disturbances as they occurred singly. Now, one of the things that the report looked at was that the impacts and the consequences and the management responses will vary considerably across the rural to urban gradient. Forests just don't occur in the rural environment. They're important in that wildland urban interface, and certainly increasingly important in the urban arena. And so what the report also does is sort of talk about the different impacts in that along that gradient, the different responses, both in terms of ecological responses, but also differences in terms of how management might respond to deal with those. So just focusing on the lower line, looking first at rural, we're looking at how changes in environmental drivers might influence decisions to plant forest or plant crops. So land use switchings could be a factor. Forestry dependent communities might be significantly impacted, and there'd be impact on the rural economy. Some of those, at least in private land, can be influenced by incentives that make folks make choices. In the wildland-urban interface, fire risk is an important issue, impacts home values and safety. Programs such as FireWise can help adapt or mitigate some of those impacts. And in the urban area, the concern is primarily over tree health and how that influences human comfort and energy use, but it requires some really intensive treatments, and probably more intensive treatments, to keep those trees healthy and productive. So there's a clear recognition that these impacts are not just on forests in the rural environment, but it spans that gradient from rural to urban. The other thing that the report focuses on is that as you look at this graph in particular, you can see it. It's a very different world in terms of ownership patterns of forests in the western United States relative to the eastern United States. The purple color is private forest, the green color is public forest. And so these differences in ownership patterns will likely substantially influence management responses because their objectives, their ability to respond quickly to policy incentives or market incentives really differs. It also is clear that because of the large amount of forest in the eastern United States that's privately held, is that a lot of the action and the potential for management responses to mitigate the potential impacts or mitigate the rate of CO2 increase is going to be perhaps a initiative primarily focused in the eastern United States. And Dave Peterson will talk about that a little bit more.
Jim, let me interject here for a minute.
Okay.
Some of your colleagues have just finished the Southern Forest Futures Project, and they're talking about substantial land use changes in the southern U.S., especially or including the loss of forest to development and the like. I know you talked a lot about stressors, but how does this one play into some of the results from your report?
Right. Well, I think that this interaction between climate change and land use change, in particular loss of forest, potential loss of forest, especially in the eastern United States, that is projected with the Southern Forest Futures Project and the RPA, is a really critical interaction. You know, just losing forest in its own right will directly impact the ability of the forest to sequester carbon in the region. Even though you might get some increases in small pockets due to better growing conditions, if forest is lost, the net effect on carbon sequestration potential will decline. Also, with that forest land cover loss, you know, the result is a much more fragmented landscape. And when we talk about the need for both plants and animals to migrate in order to survive a rapidly changing climate, that fragmented landscape really makes the ability for species to move to more suitable habitat much more difficult, and increases the likelihood of local extinctions or the need for management intervention to perhaps even assist the migration of species. And then on the more biophysical, typically that loss of forest cover comes at an increase in impervious surface and urban, peri-urban, suburban type of a land use or land cover. And we know from decades of knowledge about the differences in water cycling in forested versus urban areas, that has some real implications for water quality, flooding, and responses to extreme precipitation events. So that interaction between land cover change and climate change is a real serious and important component of future responses. Okay, what I'd like to do now is transition the presentation to Dave Peterson, and take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Jim. You did a great job in covering all the biophysical changes that have either already occurred or we expect might occur in the future. And so I think this is a very compelling message for everyone about kind of a different context in which forestry might exist in the coming decades. Also, I think Jim portrayed some of the uncertainty we have about some of these effects. So one of the real challenges that we have in managing forests in the future is dealing with some of this uncertainty, and I'll try to address that now. So we have really a couple broad things that we can do in response to climate change in forest systems. First of all, we can try to slow it down. That's often called mitigation. Some people simplify it to just managing carbon. We can also try to buy ourselves some time. Realistically, even if we brought down greenhouse gas emissions significantly, the climate would continue to warm for many decades, maybe even a couple of centuries. So the idea here is that we need to prepare our systems for this change, and we need to transition them into some future states that might be able to create some resilience and continue to have sustainable resource production in our forests. Let's talk about a few of these things now. This is a kind of a messy slide, and there's no need to try to read everything on here, but generally I just want to emphasize that we're going here essentially from the left, which is a very broad scale, to the right, more of a focused or narrow scale. So most of our activity to date has been in this part of the figure where we're developing some options, developing scientific foundation for adaptation and strategic approaches. More detailed tactical measures, we have some of those, but they haven't really been applied that much yet. So we're kind of in this middle phase right now here, and hopefully transitioning further into the more specific applications in the future. Okay, let's talk a little bit about carbon mitigation. There are a number of general things that can be done to try to retain carbon in forest ecosystems, or at least in wood. First of all, we can increase forest area. This is often called afforestation, or we can decrease deforestation, or both. We can manage carbon in existing forests in a way that will tend to retain more and more carbon. We can also use wood as biomass energy. In this case, the wood is essentially replacing or substituting for fossil fuel that might otherwise be used to produce and use building materials. Getting a little bit more focused here, carbon mitigation tactics, there's a number of things, again, we can do. Reducing harvest is one thing that may not always be an option on forests where we have a focus on timber production. We can protect those forest areas that have large amounts of carbon stored in them. For example, in the Pacific Northwest where I live, some of our more productive forests do store an awful lot of carbon. We can implement fuel treatments where appropriate. This is already being done in the southern U.S. and, of course, in the West, where we're trying to prevent crown fires. We can manage effectively to increase the growth of some forests where that's an option. Carbon can be stored in wood products. So long-lived products used in building materials, for example, are very useful for storing carbon over many decades to centuries. And we can also reduce the waste in processing of wood. Again, the idea of substitution, if you have the option of using wood instead of steel or concrete, that's a great thing to do. Steel and concrete use something like 10 times more fossil fuels for their production than wood does. And again, using wood for bioenergy, if not as a sole source, at least as a supplemental source. Now, fortunately, we do have some things available to us on which we can base our activities, so we aren't really flying around blind here. We published this first analysis of how adaptation can be done across a broad landscape a few years ago. This focused on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, where I live. And we also recently published this book, which we're calling a guidebook for adaptation options. And although it was targeted at national forests in the U.S., I think most of this publication could be applied to most forest landscapes in the U.S. And finally, we have the Climate Change Resource Center. Now, this is a website that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service, and it has a tremendous amount of information on it, almost all of which is customized to make it accessible to landowners and resource managers. So if you haven't had an opportunity to check out this website, I recommend that you do that. There are a lot of fact sheets on here, short summaries of different topics that might be very useful in explaining the effects of climate change on different resources. There are short courses on adaptation and carbon management and a whole host of other topics. And again, this is very palatable. You can look at it for 5 minutes or you can look at it for an hour. It's always changing, very dynamic, with new information being added all the time. So let's be a little more specific. What's been happening recently with adaptation? So adaptation activities have increased quite a bit over the last 5 to 6 years, and in this case, federal agencies have had a pretty much of a leadership role in doing some of that. Now, as I suggested earlier, most adaptation to date has been primarily of a strategic or overarching nature. It's really focused more on resistance or resilience to various stressors like fire and insects. To date, there really hasn't been that much implementation, at least in formal planning documents, project plans, policy, and so forth, and unfortunately, not as much implementation on the ground as we would like. Some of the sectors of the U.S. that have done a good job are, interestingly, municipalities. Some of our big cities like New York, Chicago, and some of our coastal cities have really been doing a good job of preparing for altered future conditions. And in the wake of Hurricane Sandy this past year, that was kind of a wake-up call, I think, for some coastal communities that if we do have more storms like that, they really need to be prepared for a different-looking future.
Dave, let me get you back a little bit to the tactics. And can you refine what you're talking about in terms of management practices that the audience or those who are forest managers or land managers, what can they do to increase resilience in the forest or a forest setting?
Sure. And we'll get into this a little bit more specifically in a minute, but there are a number of things that forest managers already do that are increasing resilience. For example, the point I had mentioned about doing hazardous fuel treatments. So if you're reducing fuels, if you're thinning your forests, then not only are you making those trees more vigorous, but you're creating a condition in which those stands will be more resistant to fires. So you reduce the threat of crown fires. Again, stand density management is often something that we would do ostensibly to make our trees grow faster, but also makes those trees more vigorous and more able to resist other stressors like insects and fungal pathogens. So there are a number of things like this, and I would say in general that anything you do to make your stand more healthy will generally be a good way to also enhance climate change resilience. So this is an example here that illustrates what I just mentioned. And this is showing in Ponderosa Pine Stand in the west. And you can see the high density stand on the left side here. This is what a lot of forest, a lot of dry forest in the Intermountain West looks like at the current time. Now, we can choose to use active management to create stands that look more like this. And diagrammatically, we go from a stand with a lot of ladder fuels that can aid in the passage of fuels from the surface up to the crown to something that looks a little bit more like this. Now, what you do depends on exactly what your objectives are for that particular forest area. But in this case, this kind of more open stand will, in the long term, probably be more resilient to warmer climate. Droughts will not be quite as effective at creating stress in a lower density stand. At the same time, we have to be aware of creating resilience at large spatial scales. Across the U.S., and especially on federal lands, an awful lot of our management has focused at relatively small spatial scales, maybe 40 to 100 acres. But in this case, we really need to start thinking a little bit more at managing and planning across very large landscapes and to create some diversity across those landscapes so everything doesn't look the same. I believe that at least one of the reasons that we've had these outbreaks of mountain pine beetles is that so much of the West has consisted of older, high-density, low-vigor lodgepole pine stands, so they're very susceptible to insect attack. I think in the future, if we create a greater diversity of size classes, age classes, and structures, we might have more resilience. I just referred to it as not putting all your eggs in one basket, and hopefully that way we won't lose everything at the same time if we do have extended droughts in the future. So just to kind of bring us to a conclusion here, I want to wrap up a little bit about what we have talked about today, what Jim talked about first, and then also about management. We feel that by far the biggest impact in the future will be the effect of climate change on disturbances, especially extreme disturbance. Yes, we'll have small temperature increases. Yes, some things will change, but these big fires are game changers. Big insect attacks are game changers. We anticipate that bark beetles will be a major player in this. Other kinds of insects as well have major effects on forests and probably will continue to do so. And then finally, exotic species and our invasive plants and pathogens, we expect that will probably become more of an issue, but we're pretty uncertain right now exactly what that will look like in the future. In terms of processes, Jim pointed out there will be potentially significant changes in hydrologic and biogeochemical cycling, but that's going to vary a lot by regions of the U.S. and by forest ecosystem, and they too will interact with this changing of disturbance regimes, and especially in the western U.S., changes in the snowpack in mountainous regions. We do anticipate that a lot of our flora and fauna will start to move upward in elevation and northward, but again, there will be a high degree of variability there, and it will probably be relatively difficult to predict. And at the current time, our models don't really do that great of a job on that prediction. And finally, we anticipate that carbon storage will probably decrease in western forests, primarily because of the extreme disturbance issues we've already talked about. Fires and insects can remove a lot of carbon at one time. But there's at least a potential that carbon could increase in some of our eastern forests, at least in the short term. Now, a lot of our land management agencies already are accustomed to doing things that are basically sustainable forestry or conducive to sustainable forestry. And if we're doing that, we're probably also doing things that are climate smart. Now, this is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit, but the climate smart and sustainability are roughly equivalent. So if we can stay somewhere in this ballpark, I think we have a chance to do some good adaptation across forest lands. So our strategic approaches to adaptation are certainly becoming more common across the U.S., but right now on the ground implementation is mostly confined to case studies, and it would be nice if we could accelerate that pace of implementation. And I think it's really useful for both scientists and resource managers to think in terms of risk management. Climate change effects are certainly risks to the sustainability of our forest ecosystems. If we think in terms of managing those risks, often it becomes a little bit more comfortable because most forest managers are dealing with risk all the time. The risk of fire, the risk of a big storm, the risk of regeneration failures, fungal pathogens, and so forth. So climate change is just another stressor, and I think if we think of it in more of the mainstream of how we address other stressors and risks in forest ecosystems, we'll have a good chance of doing some things that will confer some resilience on our forest ecosystems.
Well, thank you, Dave. I see we're coming close to the top of the hour. I do want to take this opportunity to thank Dave Cleaves from Washington, D.C., Jim Vose, my colleague here at NC State and with the U.S. Forest Service, and certainly you, Dave Peterson from Seattle. I think there were a couple questions that came up. One related to how CO2 was being monitored in Mauna Loa, and I don't know if any of you want to take that on, or the balance between opposing goals, managing for grasslands versus planting more forest, if that becomes our future. So I'll let you guys tackle that if you care to, and take us out to the end of the hour. I'd like to thank you all for being a part of this today.
Before we answer that question, though, James, let me just point that I put a link in the chat box to the survey for the day. So this will take you to a SurveyMonkey survey. You need to complete that. That will redirect you back to the forestrywebinars.net portal that you can fill out your quiz and your CEU form if you desire. So thanks again.
Okay, well, really quickly, I'll answer the first question. There is a CO2 monitor, a CO2 instrument that can measure the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, located in Mauna Loa. So it is a direct scientific instrument that is measuring those CO2 concentrations in real time. Dave, did you want to handle the second question? I think I responded in the chat to the second question.
Do we have any other questions that are coming in? Now's the time.
I'll bring one up that came as a discussion point. I think it's Iverson's work, this notion that if climate change comes along, our trees may not be able to react fast enough or move as they traditionally have moved over time. Do you want to discuss assisted migration and some of the backlash that comes from that, Jim or Dave?
Well, this is Dave Peterson. I can take a run at that. So assisted migration refers to the purposeful moving of plants or animals in anticipation that their current local habitat would be so affected by climate change that they would have to be moved in order to continue to exist. And there's a lot of debate right now in the scientific community about the advisability of this. Of course, in the past, we have made some errors in terms of moving things around too much, and I think it's something that we're going to have to get into very gradually. And most of my friends in the wildlife community, fish and wildlife community, tell me that they want to be very certain that this will be a good thing before they do it, and that it won't somehow make things worse than when we started. Having said that, in the forestry world, we've certainly introduced new species in different places, and some of them have adapted quite well to those local conditions without adverse outcomes. But I think having all our facts collected before we do this would be very advisable.
Well, thank you, Dave. I know that you gentlemen have to run off to another conference. There is one outstanding question in the chat box, so maybe I'll have Lisa send that to you all individually. But on behalf of my colleague Eric Taylor at Texas Forest Service and the rest of us here at Forestry Webinars, appreciate the involvement of you all today. Thanks.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. It was a great talk, great information. I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm going to repost that link to the survey in the box, just in case you missed it the first time.